The wind moved through the empty ruins, carrying dust and the smell of old stone. Broken walls stood like silent guards, watching over the place that had been forgotten for years. Between the cracked streets, strange alien plants grew, their blue leaves glowing faintly under the pale light of the twin moons. Daniel walked slowly, scanning the area with his scanner. He was a human explorer, sent to map abandoned settlements on this side of the planet. Most of the villages he had visited were empty, only bones of buildings left behind. But here, something felt different. The air was heavy, as if the ruins were holding their breath. He moved past a collapsed archway, and that's when he saw her. A figure standing at the far end of the street, thin and still, watching him. She was an alien woman, her skin pale with a soft silver sheen, her dark hair tangled and falling around her face. Her clothes were worn and torn, as if she had traveled far without rest. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the scanner in Daniel's hand. Daniel raised his hand in greeting, but she didn't respond. Her eyes, bright and sharp, followed his every move. Then, slowly, she turned and walked away, disappearing behind the wall of a ruined house. Something in her movement told him she was not just wandering, she was hiding. Curiosity pulled him forward. He stepped through broken doorways and over piles of fallen stone. He found her sitting in the shadow of a cracked pillar, her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked tired, but her gaze was alert. It was the look of someone who had been running for a long time. "Do you live here?" Daniel asked, though he knew she wouldn't understand his words. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Then, without speaking, she pointed toward the hills outside the ruins. Her hand trembled as she did. Daniel followed her gaze but saw nothing, just the empty horizon. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ruins. The air turned cooler, and the sky deepened into shades of purple and gold. Daniel decided to set up camp near the ruins for the night. He built a small fire in a safe spot, the flames casting light on the old stone walls. The alien woman stayed a short distance away, sitting in silence. From time to time, she glanced toward the hills again, as if expecting something to appear. As darkness covered the land, a sound broke the quiet, a low, distant hum. It came from somewhere beyond the hills, slow at first, then growing louder. The woman's body tensed, and she moved closer too. Daniel, her eyes wide, she made a quick motion with her hands, pointing at the fire, then shaking her head. He understood. She wanted the fire out. Daniel put out the flames, and they crouched in the shadows. The hum grew into a deep, vibrating noise, like engines passing through the sky. A dark shape moved over the ruins, blocking the light of the moons for a moment. Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken. Whoever it was, they were searching, and the woman did not want to be found. When the sound faded into the distance, she let out a shaky breath. Daniel looked at her, realizing she had nowhere to go, no place safe enough to rest. The ruins might have been her only shelter, but they were no longer safe. He knew then that leaving her here would be the same as leaving her to danger. Still, he didn't know her name, her story, or why someone would search for her in a dead city. The night grew colder, and the stars spread across the sky. The woman shivered, pulling her thin clothes tighter around her. Daniel stood, picked up a few large stones, and began to arrange them near his camp. She watched him with a puzzled expression. He didn't speak, but his hands kept working. He had no plan yet, but something inside him told him this was the beginning of something important. Far away, in the darkness beyond the hills, two small lights appeared. They moved slowly but steadily toward the ruins. Daniel didn't see them yet, but the alien woman did. Her eyes widened, and she whispered something in her own language, a word filled with fear. The strangers were coming, and there was no more time. The two lights in the distance glowed brighter as they moved closer to the ruins. Daniel could now see them, faint but steady, like eyes watching from the darkness. The alien woman stood frozen, her silver skin catching the moonlight. Her breath came in quick bursts, and her hands clutched at her torn clothes. Daniel's instincts told him those lights meant trouble. He stepped in front of her, raising a hand to signal for her to stay. Lo, they crouched behind the broken wall of a collapsed building. The night was quiet except for the faint hum that grew louder with every second. As the lights drew nearer, Daniel caught a glimpse of shapes, 2 small flying drones. They hovered above the ground, scanning the ruins with thin beams of red light. The woman's eyes followed them with fear. Daniel realized whoever was controlling those drones was looking for her. They stayed hidden until the hum began to fade. Again, the drones drifted away, vanishing into the hills. The woman let out a slow breath, but her hands still trembled. Daniel knew she couldn't keep running like this. She needed a safe place, something stronger than the ruins around them. He pointed to a clear space near his camp, then picked up a stone. She tilted her head, confused at first. But when he placed the stone down and added another on top of it, she seemed to understand. Her eyes softened for a moment, as if the idea of a shelter had touched something deep inside her. Daniel began to gather more stones from the ruins. Some were heavy, their surfaces rough and cold. The woman hesitated, then joined him. Carrying smaller stones in her arms, they worked in silence, the only sounds being the scrape of stone and the faint rustle of alien plants in the night wind. By bit, the base of a wall began to rise. It wasn't much yet, but it was something, a barrier between her and the open night. The woman glanced at the hills often, as if expecting the drones to return. Her movements grew quicker, more urgent. As they worked, Daniel noticed marks on the ground near one of the fallen walls. They were blackened, like something had been burned there recently. He crouched to touch the marks. The stone was still faintly warm. It hadn't been long since someone had been here. The woman saw him looking at the marks. She shook her head quickly and made a slicing motion with her hand. Then she pointed to the horizon and pressed her finger to her lips. It was clear. She wanted him to be quiet, and she wanted him to understand that danger was close. They kept building through the night. The base of the shelter grew taller, the stones fitting together in uneven but sturdy layers. Daniel's hands were scraped and sore, but he didn't stop. The woman, despite her fragile appearance, worked with surprising strength. Now and then she looked at the rising walls with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read, part relief, part disbelief. Just before dawn, a sound broke the silence. A faint metallic click. Daniel froze. The woman's eyes snapped toward the direction of the sound. From behind one of the ruined houses, a dark shadow moved. It was tall, armored, and carrying a weapon that glinted in the moonlight. Daniel's pulse quickened. The figure paused, scanning the area, then moved slowly toward the spot where they had put out the fire last night. The woman's breathing grew fast again. She took a step back, her foot brushing against a loose stone. It rolled across the ground with a small clatter. The shadow stopped. Daniel grabbed her arm gently and pulled her down behind the wall of the half-built shelter. The figure began walking in their direction, each step heavy and slow. Daniel's mind raced. He had no weapon strong enough to fight someone in armor, but maybe, if they stayed hidden, the stranger would pass. The footsteps came closer. Then, without warning, the figure stopped again. A second shadow joined the first. Another armored being, speaking in a low, harsh language. The two figures seemed to argue for a moment before turning away. Daniel and the woman stayed still until the sound of their boots faded into the distance. The first light of dawn touched the ruins, painting the broken walls in gold and pink. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with both fear and gratitude. She touched the wall they had built and then looked back at him. It wasn't a home yet, but it was the beginning of one far away. The hum of engines rose again. Daniel knew they would return, but now they had something worth protecting, and he wasn't about to stop building. The day passed in uneasy silence. Daniel and the alien woman worked on the stone shelter until the sun dipped low. The walls were now waist-high, enough to hide behind if needed. But Daniel knew they were far from safe. The woman moved with quiet urgency, her silver skin glowing faintly under the fading light. She kept glancing toward the hills, her eyes scanning every shadow. Daniel didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Her fear told him enough. By the time darkness returned, the air felt heavier. The ruins seemed to hold a breath they would not release. Daniel lit no fire that night. The cold bit at his fingers, but warmth was less important than staying hidden. They sat inside the half-built shelter, backs to the stone. The only light came from the moons above, pale and distant. The woman sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her gaze fixed on the open sky. Daniel noticed the way her eyes narrowed. Whenever she heard a sound, she was listening for something she expected. It came just past midnight, a faint hum, low at first, then growing. Daniel's chest tightened. He had heard that sound before. The woman tensed, her breath quickening. She grabbed his arm and pointed toward the far end of the ruins. From the shadows emerged figures, tall, armored, and moving with purpose. There were 3 of them this time. Their weapons hung at their sides, sleek and sharp. They moved in a slow sweep through the ruins, scanning each collapsed building. Daniel's first instinct was to retreat deeper into the shadows, but one of the figures turned and began walking toward their shelter. The woman's grip on his arm tightened, her nails digging into his sleeve. Her eyes begged him for silence. The figure stopped near the burned markings Daniel had found earlier. He crouched, touching the blackened stone with gloved fingers. Then he spoke into a small device on his wrist, his voice low but sharp. From somewhere above, a drone descended, its red scanning beam sweeping over the area. Daniel ducked lower, pulling the woman with him. The beam passed over the edge of the stone wall. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. If the light swept just a little further, it would catch them. The drone hesitated, its lens turning toward their position. But then a sudden crash echoed from the other side of the ruins. One of the armored figures shouted something, and the group moved toward the sound. The drone followed, leaving their hiding spot untouched. Daniel exhaled slowly. The woman's hands were still trembling, but she didn't let go of his sleeve. They waited in silence until the footsteps and the hum of the drone faded. Only then did she release him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel studied her in the moonlight. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also something else, a deep sadness. She was not just hiding from strangers, she was running from a part of her life she could not return to. She touched her chest, then pointed toward the direction the hunters had gone. Her lips moved, forming words Daniel couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear. They would be back, and they would not stop. The rest of the night passed. In uneasy stillness, Daniel stayed awake, listening for every sound. His mind turned over the same thought. The stone shelter was not enough. If they were going to survive, it had to be stronger, higher and hidden before dawn. Daniel rose quietly and began carrying more stones to their wall. The woman joined him, still silent, but now moving with more determination. They worked until the first rays of sunlight touched the ruins. The walls were a little taller, the shelter a little stronger. But as Daniel looked toward the horizon, he saw something that made his stomach twist. A thin trail of smoke rose from the hills. Not the smoke of a campfire. This was darker, thicker. It meant someone was marking their path. Someone was coming, and they knew exactly where to go. Asterisk. The trail of dark smoke on the horizon haunted Daniel all day. It was a signal, he was sure of it. Somewhere beyond those hills, the hunters were gathering. And each hour they waited here only gave their enemies more time. The alien woman worked beside him, her hands lifting and placing stones without pause. Her movements were strong but tense, like someone carrying a weight inside their heart. Daniel noticed how she glanced at him sometimes, as if deciding whether or not to speak. But each time she looked away, choosing silence. By midday, the stone walls were almost as high as Daniel's shoulders. He paused to drink water, offering her some as well. She took the flask and sipped, her silver skin catching the sunlight. Then she set it down, took a deep breath. and touched her chest. "Lyria," she said softly. Daniel blinked. It was the first word he had heard from her that made sense. He repeated it. "Lyria," testing the sound on his tongue. A faint smile touched her lips, but it faded quickly. Replaced by a shadow in her eyes, she pointed to herself again. "Lyria," then pointed toward the hills. Her voice trembled as she spoke more words in her language. Daniel couldn't understand, but her tone was enough, fear mixed with anger. Then she crouched in the dirt and began to draw with a small stone. At first, the shapes were simple: tall towers, a shining city. Then she drew a symbol Daniel had seen before on the hunter's armor. She circled it and struck through it with the stone. Her hand tightened, the lines becoming sharper, angrier. Daniel realized what she was telling him. She had come from that city the hunters served, the same people who had driven her out. She wiped away part of the drawing, leaving only the symbol crossed out. Then she pointed to herself and shook her head. They had rejected her, marked her as an enemy. Daniel wanted to know more. Why had they chased her here, to the edge of nowhere? What had she done, or what had been done to her? But Lyria's eyes lowered, and she stepped back, closing herself again. Whatever her story was, it was not one she could share easily. That night, the wind grew colder, carrying strange scents: metal, smoke, and something sharp. Daniel sat inside the half-built shelter, sharpening a piece of metal into a blade. Lyria sat across from him, silent but watchful. From time to time, she glanced toward the dark hills, her hands tightening around her knees. Hours passed before the first sound came, not the hum of drones this time, but the faint crunch of footsteps. On stone, Daniel froze, his hand tightening around the blade. Lyria's head turned sharply toward the sound, her silver eyes wide. A shadow passed across the gap in the wall. Then another. Voices murmured in a language Daniel couldn't understand, but the tone was harsh, commanding. The hunters were back, moving slowly, methodically. Daniel signaled for Lyria to stay low. They crouched behind the wall, the cool stone pressing against their backs. The footsteps came closer. Daniel's heartbeat pounded in his ears, each thud loud in the silence. The hunters paused, their boots scraping the dirt. One of them stepped just beyond the wall, so close Daniel could see the scratches in the armor. A gloved hand rested on the top of the stone, fingers curling over it. Daniel held his breath, ready to strike if he had to. Then from somewhere deeper in the ruins, a loud crash echoed. The hand pulled back, and the hunters spoke quickly. Moving toward the noise, Daniel waited until their footsteps faded before looking at Lyria. She exhaled shakily, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in minutes. They were safe, for now, but Daniel knew the truth. The hunters wouldn't stop until they caught her. And now, with her name spoken aloud, Lyria was no longer just a stranger. She was someone worth protecting. The sky began to lighten with the first pale glow of dawn. Daniel looked at the walls they had built and felt a surge of determination. If the hunters came again, they wouldn't find her hiding in the open. This shelter would become more than a few stacked stones. It would be a fortress. Lyria stood beside him, watching the sunrise with quiet eyes. Her voice was soft but steady as she spoke a few more words in her language. Daniel didn't understand them, but he understood the way she looked at him. It was the look of someone who had decided to trust, and in that moment, Daniel knew, whatever truth she was hiding, they would face it together. The morning after the hunters came, Daniel didn't waste a single moment. The shelter had kept them hidden, but it wouldn't hold if the hunters decided to attack. They needed more than walls. They needed a fortress. He walked the ruins at first light, searching for the strongest stones. Some were half buried in dirt, their edges worn smooth by years of wind and rain. Others were sharp and jagged, perfect for making a wall that would be hard to climb. Lyria followed him silently, carrying stones in her arms without being asked. By midday, the walls were taller than Daniel. He used mud mixed with fine gravel to seal the gaps. It wasn't pretty, but it made the walls stronger. Lyria watched closely, then began doing the same on the other side. Her hands worked fast, her movements showing a quiet determination. They built narrow openings in the walls, wide enough to see through, but too small for someone to easily pass. Daniel also cleared a hidden path behind the shelter, in case they needed to escape quickly. Every step was about survival now. The hunters would come back, and when they did, he wanted them to find more than a frightened woman and a man with a few stones. That night, Daniel sat by the wall, sharpening a spear made from a broken piece of metal. The fortress was not finished yet, but it already felt stronger. Lyria sat inside, running her fingers over the stones as if memorizing them. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "Safe," she said in broken English. Daniel gave a small nod. It wasn't safe yet, but it would be. The wind carried strange scents again that evening. Smoke, faint at first, then stronger. Daniel climbed to the top of the wall and scanned the dark. Hills, flickers of orange light glowed in the distance. Campfires, more than one. The hunters weren't alone anymore. He climbed down quickly, telling Lyria with gestures to stay inside. Then he began placing heavy stones along the top of the wall. If the hunters tried to climb, the stones could be pushed down on them. Lyria joined him, her hands moving without hesitation. The night was silent except for the whisper of the wind. But Daniel didn't trust the quiet. He stayed awake, leaning against the wall, his spear within reach. Lyria sat nearby, her silver eyes catching the moonlight whenever she turned her head. Hours passed before the first sign of movement appeared. A faint red glow swept across the ruins, a scanning light. Daniel's grip tightened on the spear. The light grew brighter, sliding along the wall. Then it stopped, as if focusing directly on their shelter. From the darkness came the sound of boots on stone. Low voices murmured to each other. Shadows moved closer, their shapes tall and sharp-edged. Daniel crouched, ready to defend the wall. Lyria stood behind him, her eyes locked on the movement. Outside, the first figure appeared at the edge of the wall. Daniel didn't hesitate. He shoved a heavy stone from the top. It crashed down, hitting the ground with a loud thud. The figure stumbled back, cursing in a language Daniel didn't know. Another tried to climb, but Lyria grabbed the smaller stone and threw it with surprising force. It struck the climber's helmet, sending him back down. The hunters retreated for a moment, regrouping in the shadows. Daniel's heart pounded, but there was no time to relax. A sudden buzzing filled the air. 2 drones rose into view. Their red beams swept over the walls, searching for gaps. Daniel grabbed his spear and hurled it at the nearest one. It hit the drone's side, sending sparks into the night. The machine spun out of control and crashed into the dirt. The second drone pulled back, flying higher. Daniel knew it would return with more of them. But for now, the fortress had held. The hunters melted back into the darkness. The only proof of their visit was the broken drone and the heavy silence they left behind. Lyria stepped forward, her hands brushing the stones. She looked at Daniel with a rare, small smile. "Strong," she said. Daniel nodded, looking at the fortress they had built together. It wasn't just stone anymore. It was a promise. A promise that the next time the hunters came, they would not find easy prey. Far away, beyond the hills, the faint hum of engines began again. The night wasn't over yet. The hum of engines in the distance grew louder through the night. Daniel didn't need to see them to know the hunters were coming back. This time, there would be more of them. The broken drone from earlier had surely told them everything they needed to know. Lyria stood at the wall, her silver eyes scanning the horizon. The faint glow of dawn painted the hills in soft gold, but there was no peace in it. Every shadow could be an enemy. Every gust of wind could hide their approach. Daniel tightened the leather straps on his arms, gripping the spear he had sharpened. Again and again by midday, the fortress felt different. It was no longer just a shelter. It was a place that would be tested. Daniel had placed heavy stones along the top of the wall and set traps near the hidden path behind them. Lyria had sharpened small pieces of broken metal. lining them inside the wall where hands might grab. If the hunters wanted in, they would bleed for it. The first sign of the attack came with the sudden cry of birds scattering from the hills. Daniel looked toward the sound and saw figures moving, 6 of them, armored and carrying long weapons. 2 drones hovered above, scanning ahead like hunting hawks. Lyria's grip on her makeshift weapon tightened. She looked at Daniel and nodded once. No running this time. The hunters spread out as they approached. Their voices carried across the ruins, low but confident. One of the drones swept over the fortress, its red beam sliding along the stones. Daniel ducked low, motioning for Lyria to stay hidden. Then, when the drone passed close again, he hurled a stone with all his strength. It struck the drone's lens, cracking it. The machine spun wildly before crashing against a wall. The sudden noise made the hunters break into a run. The first one reached the wall, grabbing for a stone. A sharp cry followed as his hand met the hidden metal shards. Lyria appeared above him, shoving a heavy rock down. It struck his shoulder, knocking him back to the ground. Another tried to climb near the hidden path. Daniel rushed over, thrusting his spear down between the stones. The tip caught the hunter's armor and forced him to retreat. But the others kept coming. They were relentless. The second drone fired a burst of red energy at the wall. Stone shattered, spraying dust into the air. Daniel pulled Lyria down just as another shot hit. A section of the wall cracked but held. He knew it wouldn't last forever. The hunters regrouped outside. One of them raised a long tube-shaped weapon and aimed. A deep thump sounded, and something heavy hit the wall with a sharp blast. The stones shook, a few tumbling to the ground. Lyria grabbed Daniel's arm, urging him toward the escape path. But Daniel shook his head. Not yet. Instead, he reached for one of the traps he had prepared. A rope tied to a pile of loose stones on the wall's edge. He pulled hard, and the stones tumbled down onto 2 hunters below. The crash sent them sprawling, their weapons clattering away. Lyria moved quickly, grabbing one of the fallen weapons and tossing it to Daniel. It was heavy, strange in design, but he understood enough to pull the trigger. A burst of blue energy shot out, striking the side of the remaining drone. It dropped, smoking, into the dirt. Without their drones, the hunters slowed. They shouted to each other, retreating a short distance. Daniel used the moment to repair what he could on the wall. Lyria stood beside him, her eyes still locked on the attackers. She knew they weren't done. Minutes later, they charged again. Daniel braced himself. One climbed halfway up the wall before Lyria met him with a kick that sent him tumbling back. Daniel struck another with the butt of the captured weapon, knocking him into a crumbling section of the ruins. The fight felt endless, each wave of attackers testing the walls. But each time, Daniel and Lyria held their ground. Finally, as the sun began to sink, the hunters pulled back. They moved into the shadows of the hills, dragging their wounded with them. The ruins fell quiet except for the sound of Daniel and Lyria's breathing. The fortress had held. For now Daniel leaned against the wall, his arms heavy with exhaustion. Lyria looked at him, her face streaked with dirt but her eyes shining. She stepped closer and touched the wall, then touched her heart. "Home," she said softly. Daniel felt a strange warmth in his chest at the word. It was more than stone now. It was theirs, but deep in the hills, the hunters were not finished. Daniel could almost feel their anger in the air. The next time they came, it would be with more force than before. The day after the siege, the ruins were strangely quiet. No hum of drones, no distant shouts of hunters, only the soft whisper of wind through the broken streets. Daniel knew it wasn't over. Quiet could be more dangerous than noise, he repaired the wall where the blasts had hit. Lyria helped, moving stones with the same care as before. But her eyes kept drifting toward the hills. It wasn't fear this time. It was something heavier. Daniel could see it in the way her hands slowed, as if she was thinking of a place far away. By midday, a low rumble echoed across the valley. Not the harsh growl of the hunters' machines. This was deeper, smoother. Daniel climbed the wall to look. In the distance, a sleek silver craft was descending. Its shape was different from the hunters' ships. It moved with grace, like a bird gliding down to land. Lyria froze when she saw it. Her lips parted, and a whisper in her language slipped out. Daniel didn't understand the word, but he knew. It meant something important. She stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the ship. For the first time since he met her, there was no fear in her face, only longing. The ship landed on a flat stretch of ground beyond the ruins. A ramp extended, and figures appeared. They wore armor, but not like the hunters. Their colors were brighter, their movements calm. One of them called out in Lyria's language, the sound carrying clear across the ruins. Lyria's breath caught. She turned to Daniel, her eyes searching his. "My people," she said in broken English. Daniel's grip tightened on the edge of the wall. If these were her people, why had she been running? They walked closer, weapons lowered. The leader stopped a few meters from the fortress and spoke again. Lyria stepped toward them but stopped. Looking back at Daniel, her voice was soft, almost torn. "They take me home." Daniel's chest felt heavy. She had dreamed of safety, of a place where she belonged. But he also knew the world she came from had driven her out once. Would they protect her now, or send her back into danger? The leader spoke again, this time in a language Daniel understood through a translator device on his belt. "We have come for her," the voice said evenly. "Her name will be cleared, and she will be safe among her own kind." Daniel looked at Lyria. She was staring at the open ramp of the ship, the promise of a new life pulling at her. But then her gaze shifted to the fortress walls, to the stones they had carried together, to the corner where they had hidden during the first night. Her fingers touched one of the stones, tracing the rough surface. This had been her only real home in a long time. The silence between them stretched. Daniel didn't speak. It wasn't his choice to make. He only met her eyes and gave a small nod, telling her she was free to choose. Lyria turned back to her people. The leader extended a hand toward her. She took one step forward, then stopped. Her voice was steady. "No," she said. The leader's expression shifted to surprise. "You refuse?" She nodded, turning back toward Daniel. "My home." "Here," she said, touching her chest. The leader's gaze moved from her to Daniel, studying him for a long moment. Finally he inclined his head. "As you wish," he said, and motioned for his group to return to the ship. The silver craft lifted into the sky, rising higher until it vanished into the clouds. The ruins were silent again. Lyria stood at the wall, watching the sky until the last glint of silver was gone. Then she turned to Daniel, a small but certain smile on her face. They worked together that afternoon, adding new stones to the wall. The fortress grew stronger under their hands. The hunters might return one day, but now they wouldn't face them as strangers. They would face them as a team. When the sun began to set, Daniel climbed to the top of the wall. Lyria joined him. Standing shoulder to shoulder, the sky burned with gold and red, the light catching on the stone below them. This was more than protection now. It was a promise. They had built together. The twin moons began to rise. Lyria looked out over the valley, her silver skin glowing in the moonlight. Daniel glanced at her and thought of the first time he saw her, cold, alone, hiding in the ruins. Now she stood beside him, strong, unafraid, and he knew without speaking that this place was no longer just his shelter or her refuge. It was their home.